This may come as a surprise to some, but this video, folks, that you're about to watch is one of my more anticipated records that I've had in quite some time. Yes, I'm sure that will flabbergast some people. I'll explain why I'm excited about Jacob Gill, why I think there's reason to have optimism. I'm not saying to dive headfirst into the Kirk Ferentz transfer portal pool, but I think there's reason to be excited about Iowa landing a receiver out of the portal from Northwestern named Jacob Gill. I'll talk about it in just a second. Before we get to the content, I want to thank Iowa Floor Covering. I gave them a shout out yesterday, and I want to plug them again today because they are so important to what we do. And if you've got a flooring project or just a DIY project, maybe you're working on a tile shower or have one in the works, thinking about maybe a remodel, or maybe you're buying a new home and you want some updating in said home, definitely give Tyler and Ryan, the guys down at IFC in Bondurant, a call. They can lead you in the right direction. 515-379-7000. And hint, hint, folks, they are Hawkeye fans. They will be good to you. Mention my name, mention From the Hawkeye of the Storm. Let them know that you appreciate their support for this channel. We certainly do. I certainly do appreciate the support from Iowa Floor Covering down in Bondurant. Their website, www.iowafloorcovering.com. So the latest recruiting news from Iowa football. Northwestern transfer Jacob Gill committing to the Hawkeyes. This news catching some people off guard. It dropped on Tuesday. Gill was kind of a name we hadn't heard a lot of rumblings about. I'm not on the recruiting beat, but apparently he did take a visit to Iowa City here earlier this week and liked it enough that he gave Iowa a pledge, gave him a commitment. I'll give you a little bit of a background on Jacob Gill, and then I'll give you what I see when I watch him on tape and why I'm actually cautiously optimistic, but maybe a little bit more than cautiously optimistic. And maybe you're going to call me crazy, but I'll explain in a second. Jacob Gill is a young man. He's played 3 years of college football. He was originally from Raleigh, North Carolina, had some good offers, was not a real highly rated recruit. I mean, he was like 1,100, 1,200 nationally ranked in the country, but he did have offers from some local schools, including Charlotte. He had a North Carolina State offer. I did see that 247 Sports had predicted that he would land at North Carolina State. He ends up going to Northwestern, also had a Louisville offer, and had some solid FBS non-Power 5 offers from App State, Liberty, East Carolina. But he ends up settling on Northwestern. Did play very early in his career as a true freshman. And I went back and basically watched all of his receptions of 10 yards or more. And there's not a ton, all right? He has not had a single season of over 100 yards. Here's his stats that I'm putting up here on the screen. Pretty modest. And as you see, last year, 2023, played in just 4 games, reportedly dealt with an injury and was hobbled much of the year. There is good news associated with that stat from last year because he only played in 4 games. The 4-game redshirt rule would apply to him. If he so desires and Iowa wants him back for a 5th year, he could come back for a 5th year, which means he has 2 seasons of eligibility remaining. And he does have familiarity with Brendan Sullivan, who's also out of the transfer portal. Now, Gill caught most of his passes from Ryan Helinski. We know Sullivan has been a guy who's gotten plenty of snaps and some starts in that Northwestern offense. And that Northwestern team, as I talked about when Sullivan committed, has been bad, especially offensively. They did exceed expectations last year to an extent, but again, Gill was really not a part of that. He's listed at 6 foot tall, 6 foot even. I saw one website listed him at 5'11", about $190. He did set all kinds of records at Cardinal Gibbons High School in Raleigh. In fact, if you look at some of his stats from high school, take a look at this. From high school in 2018, Gill ended up totaling nearly 1,200 receiving yards and 18 touchdowns. 2019 had 800 yards through the air with 9 receiving touchdowns. So 2,000 yards in just 2 seasons there for Jacob Gill in high school. 27 receiving touchdowns on 138 receptions. Now, not saying that you should expect some explosion of production his first year at Iowa, but those are impressive numbers, and he was reportedly the most sought-after player in the history of that high school. Now, I did hear some people on Twitter. I don't follow a lot of people on X, but I do have these things come across my timeline, unfortunately, my news feed, And I heard some people, some talking heads, one specifically who will remain unnamed, making fun of Iowa for landing a guy who literally totaled 11 yards last year, 99 yards the year before, and 85 yards his freshman year. So basically someone who has not been productive, even with an offense that you would think if he's really good, he's going to be able to emerge. I understand that take. I went back and watched his play at Northwestern. There wasn't anything that necessarily stood out to me or jumped off the screen at me. I did find some track numbers from high school. He's got a decent 55-meter dash time. I think it was like 7:11, his personal record in high school, which is good speed. Again, not insane speed. It's good speed. I think it was interesting. I went back and watched one of his games where he had a double-digit reception, and then 2 plays later, he fumbles the ball. Call ends up getting overturned to an incomplete pass. So that's something where he should have held on to the ball, technically never completed the catch, so it won't go in the stats as a fumble, but it is one of the few highlights that we have of Jacob Gill. I've also heard some people chatter about him potentially being a slot guy at Iowa. And I don't know what Tim Lester envisions. I'm not about to claim that I do. However, just looking at his size, 5'11", 6 foot, I understand why some people may say that. But I will not be surprised if he ends up running on the outside for Iowa a lot. If you look at a guy like Seth Anderson, I think is listed at maybe 6'1". Amir Smith-Marset wasn't bigger than maybe 6'1". I don't think Tim Lester is too concerned with height. All right. And I think Iowa in general, not saying it's specifically on Kelton Copeland or Brian Ferentz or Kirk Ferentz, but collectively they've been too concerned with height, with recruiting. Obviously, wide receiver recruiting has been a joke in recent years, and development has been a joke. Production has been a joke. Production has not been. Development, production, and recruiting had not been a joke when Tim Lester was the head coach at Western Michigan. Now, how much credit do you give Tim for that? He's a former quarterback. I got to give him some credit as a former signal caller for the production, development, and recruitment of these young wideouts. Let me give you some anecdotal evidence. You may have heard of these guys when Tim Lester was initially hired by Iowa. Let's talk about 3 guys, one being Sky Moore. You may recognize his name, wide receiver for the Kansas City Chiefs. In case you didn't know, Sky Moore was a Western Michigan standout under Tim Lester as a head coach. Sky Moore had nearly 2,500 receiving yards over the course of 3 years, had 16 touchdowns. He was listed at 5'10". 5'10". You want to know what his recruiting list looked like out of high school? Western Michigan, Howard, Rice, and Robert Morris. Rice, the only other FBS school on that list. Sky Moore was not a local kid. He was from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, but Tim Lester's staff obviously identified him, liked him, and boy, they hit the jackpot with a kid who ended up being a second-round pick. How about Jayden Reed? Jayden Reed's another one you may be familiar with, former Michigan State wide receiver. Interestingly enough, he started his career at Western Michigan, and in his true freshman year had 800 receiving yards and 8 touchdowns, and was electric enough to know, hey, I have some stock if I enter the portal. Went into the transfer portal, went to Michigan State, ended up totaling nearly 3,000 receiving yards in his college career. He ends up being a second-round draft pick. So how much credit do you give Tim Lester for that? Well, they did identify the kid, and he put up some impressive numbers as a true freshman. You look at his recruiting list, Central Michigan, Miami, Ohio, Toledo, Western Michigan. In fact, 247 had such a short list for Jayden Reed, they listed Western Michigan twice. I'm not joking. I kind of am joking, obviously. I think it's more of a clerical error, but I digress. No other Power 5 offers for Jayden Reed, who ended up being a second-round draft pick and is currently on the Green Bay Packers roster. How about Dwayne Eskridge? He's another one you may recognize. Eskridge was incredible at Western Michigan, played 5 seasons there, totaled nearly 2,300 yards in spite of a 2019 year that was hampered by injury, had just 73 yards that year. He was a second-round draft pick. He is currently on the Seattle Seahawks. All those guys are 6 foot or less. Dwayne Eskridge is 5'9". Yes, 5'9". I mentioned Sky Moore at 5'10", and Jayden Reed is 5'11", 6 foot, depending on what you look at. Probably closer to 5'11". Remember, Iowa was in on the kid from Missouri State that just committed to Fresno State here, a week or two ago. Haven't really talked about that much on this show. Really small kid, had speed. Here's my point, folks. I'm not saying Jacob Gill is going to be the next great thing, but it's been a while since you've had reason to put trust in Iowa with the wide receiver position, and understandably so. It's also frustrating that they promoted John Budmeyer. At least it is to me. Here's a guy who's never coached receivers. However, let's give Budmeyer credit for one thing. He does understand the passing game. And although quarterback development didn't look great when he was kind of taking the lead with that these last 2 years, he's working with Tim Lester, who has a track record with receivers, with unheralded receivers, guys who did not have a bunch of offers. And by the way, the one player I didn't mention a recruiting list for, Dwayne Eskridge, had only one other FBS offer from Ball State. So none of those guys were recruited highly. And Tim Lester helped to make all those kids future stars and second-round draft picks. Each of those guys, future second-round draft picks. So I have reason to guess that Tim Lester has the ability to get every last ounce of effort and production out of these guys. And I have reason to think he can see some things that, probably many things, that the average fan does not, and that the stat sheet does not reflect. So let's just wait and see. Yes, they missed on the kid that went to Fresno. They got Jacob Gill, who is not real highly sought after, but this is a different offense than we've seen, okay? I know proof is in the pudding, but it's going to look different to an extent, to a large extent, and I think part of that is going to be development at certain key positions, wide receiver, quarterback. If those positions develop, the offense is going to take a jump regardless of what the X's and O's look like and what the scheme looks like. And we have reason to believe, at least I do, that Tim Lester is on the track, is on the right track, and is the right man to get that done here at Iowa. There's my rant for the day, folks. I just wanted to run through those numbers. I just think really impressive track record, really impressive stuff from Tim Lester. And we haven't really talked a lot about it because they haven't gotten anybody at receiver until now. Not in high school, not from the transfer portal, but now they have a Tim Lester kid in Jacob Gill out of Northwestern, who again is listed at 5'11", 6 foot tall, and has not put together great stats, but Tim Lester wanted him. So I'm intrigued by the commitment. Appreciate you tuning in, folks, for another edition of the show. Please hit that thumbs up button if you're a Hawkeye fan, and definitely subscribe if you're a Hawkeye fan, and we'll talk to you next time.